Hey everybody. So I'm going to tell you a story about a fatal accident that occurred November 6th, 1986. And so these were two friends of ours from two separate families, neighbors, that were killed in a 1959 K35 Bonanza. And the significance about this accident, unlike a lot of accidents that we talk about or that we watch on YouTube that we're all interested in, including myself, where we're looking at the pilot or pilots going, why did they do that? This is scary, this kind of an accident, because it isn't one of those. And it's more indicative of the kind of accidents that maybe we don't talk about as much because they're not one of those, oh, I should have had a V8, like why'd they do that? And the other thing about this accident that is unique is that I'm going to be able to tell this to you from a perspective that most people wouldn't. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I was there and helped them push the airplane out. I was 17 years old at the time. And I was also there in the aftermath of this. And so any fatal accident in anything, whether it's airplanes, cars, or whatever, is obviously tragic. But this story is something that I've wanted to tell for a long time, but kind of having the guts to tell it, you know. And it really is going to be in a story format. I'll go over the NTSB final report when we get towards the end. That came out in 1988. Rather brief, is in a lot of cases they are. So what I want to do is have you think about necessary risk versus unnecessary risk, which is what I think about when I think of this accident and when it comes to aviation. I'm going to give you my background, Tim's background, who was 20 years old. He was the pilot in command. Ken, his background, he was in his early 40s. He was in the right seat, and he was the owner of the airplane. And we'll get into some known facts that I did not know at the time towards the end, because I'm going to tell you it in a story format from my perspective, because I want you to put yourself in my shoes. And would you have done anything differently than I did? I want you to put yourself in Tim's shoes. Would you have done anything differently? I want you to put yourself in Ken's shoes. Would you have done anything differently? I also have some interviews from my parents about that night, and kind of some interesting things when we talk about necessary risk versus unnecessary risk. So, before I get into the story, necessary risk. Well, if we're going to fly an airplane, that's a necessary risk. If we're going to drive a car, necessary risk. Unnecessary risk would be flying your airplane or driving your car in a blizzard, all right? And then there's everything in between, and that's what I find interesting as we get into this, all right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I knew of Tim's experience as a pilot, Ken's at the time, and then I'll get into where I was in my aviation background at the age of 17 years old. So Tim was 20 years old. He was a neighbor of ours. We lived at Crest Air Park. At the time, it's now called Norm Greer Field. It's in the Seattle area. It's about 20 miles to the southeast of Seattle. And this is a 3,300 foot private, public, paved, lit runway. And they have an FBO there with fuel and facilities and whatnot. So on the airport, all three families were neighbors. So Tim was to the south of us on the airport. His dad was an airline pilot. They had a Cessna 207, and that's an airplane they had had for a while. Tim had two younger brothers. We all went to school together. Had an older sister. Parents married. Great family. Then on the airport there, just a little bit north of them were us, our family, my mom and dad and myself. And then a little bit to the north of us was Ken with one of my very best friends, still one of my very best friends to this day. This was his stepdad, Ken. So Mike had his parents, or his mom had married Ken. This was his stepdad. They had a younger daughter at the time. She was like 8 years old, and then Ken had an older son, a few years older than Mike and I, who was my friend and friend to this day. And so that's kind of an idea of what the families were. Whenever you live on an airport, and my whole life I grew up on these airstrips, and it's a very close, tight-knit family. So if you're an aviation person, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So it's not just your regular neighborhood. It's totally a different thing altogether because you're sharing these experiences and whatnot. So Tim was following in the footsteps of his dad to be a commercial pilot. So he is, from my perspective, at my age at that time, we just knew him as a very professional person. He's 3 years older than me. Always thought of him as like very serious in a good way. Knew him to be a really good pilot. Like we all thought, oh, Tim's a great pilot, you know. I didn't know any of his ratings at the time or anything like that other than what I just told you. And so anyway, so that's what I knew as of that date, November 6, 1986. Ken, who was my buddy's stepfather, he was an air traffic controller. We also knew that he had a lot of aviation background. So from my recollection, he had done a lot of flying, had a lot of experience, instrument rated pilot. I had flown with them in that Bonanza. Maybe, I don't know, very recently prior to the accident. When I say very recently, maybe over the summer or something like that. But anyway, I was familiar with the airplane. Also familiar with BEECH cockpits at the time. We had a B-55 Baron, which is important as we get into the story. So Ken, from all that I knew at the time, very competent pilot, and he was a great guy. Kind of reminded me of like Robert Redford or something. And then Tim kind of reminded me of like a serious Jim Carrey at the time. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on there as far as what I knew. And then we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go over the NTSB report. But I just want you to think of it as my perspective as I tell you the story. So my aviation background at the time, when I was born, we lived on a little 2,000-foot grass airstrip down in Hillsboro, Oregon, called Olinger Airstrip. And when I was growing up, we were flying a 1955 Cessna 310. And when I first started, steering the airplane and all that kind of stuff, maybe, I don't know, 5 or I can't even remember, as young as you can get to where your feet are hanging, you can't touch the rudder pedals. I was just flying the 6-pack. So the first thing I ever learned how to do was fly the 6-pack. But the 310 was full dual control, as most of you know. If you don't, it's full dual control cockpit. Co-pilot and pilot instrumentation. Brake pedals, the whole 9 yards, rudder pedals, and dual controls. So we had that airplane all the way up until 1983, and that's when we moved up to the Seattle area to Crest Air Park, and my dad traded the 310 for a 1973 B-55 Baron, which was our neighbors down there in Oregon. So by the time I was at age 13, I had done a lot of flying of that 310, and I was very familiar with it. And we were kind of practicing at that time CRM, if you want to make it simple, between my dad and myself. Probably about the age of 11 or 10, we kicked my mom out of the co-pilot seat, stuck her in the back, and I started flying the co-pilot, and it was great. Loved it. So when we transitioned to the Baron, it had a throw-over control yoke. And I did not like it at all because we were used to dual control and it had these goofy throttles but that's no relevance on the Bonanza. The relevance to the Bonanza that Ken and Tim were flying was that it had a throw-over control yoke. So prior to the Baron, when we would get in situations where the weather or we got busy in the cockpit, or let's say my dad would get busy in the cockpit in the 310, if he was having to pull out charts and look up stuff and do all this stuff, I would just fly the airplane. He'd be like, hey, just fly whatever, and I'd fly whatever the heading is. And by that time, at the age of like 13, 14 years old in 1983, I was just real comfortable doing that. And so Dad would be pulling out charts and I'd be flying the airplane. With the Baron, we found that if you're in kind of rough weather or whatever, trying to get the control yoke over was, you'd only want to do that in smooth cruise, because the airplane could do a little bit of pitch up down, because what you do is there's a pin underneath the control column. So you pull this pin, right, and then it releases the yoke and it rolls over like this, okay, or vice versa. So even though the yoke is up here, you can still fly the airplane like this, but it's really weird. And of course, you're not going to do that. You're throwing it over. So it always made you think, geez, rough weather, that's kind of a pain. So when we were in situations where we got really busy, I would be in the Baron, Dad would just fly, and then I would pull the charts out and look up wherever we had to deviate to, whatever that is. All right, and so we would only be throwing the control yoke over to one another in, say, in a safe environment. So as we get into this, that'll be significant. So now we're gonna push forward to to November 6, 1986. So by that time, I had flown in this Bonanza. I had a lot of, a decent amount of time in the Baron, because at that time we were flying the Baron a lot, and we were doing a lot of long distance flying, and that's primarily where I would get a lot of really cool opportunities to fly versus just around the Seattle area. And so we had done some really a lot of long distance trips for the 3 years we'd had the Baron up until the time of this accident. So very familiar with the throw over control yoke. We had been in some bad weather and stuff like that. So so that makes it kind of interesting as I tell you the story. So let's go to the night of November 6, 1986. So that night, the night of the accident, I was over at Mike and Ken's house, and we were working on his 1963 Impala, putting a transmission in it, which he blew up trannies like right and left because it had a big, huge 383 stroker motor in there. And he had these 4-speed Saginaw transmissions. So anyway, putting a transmission in his Impala was just normal things we would do at that time. So unbeknownst to myself, Ken and Tim had been planning to go shoot some instrument approaches up into Payne Field. I did not know that at the time, but what happened is while we're in the middle of doing this transmission, the phone rings, and Mike and Ken are really deep underneath the car, and I'm a little easier to get out from underneath it, so I answer the phone. It's Tim, and the weather was, it was misty. I would call it misty, not raining, but spitting, and like kind of overcast, but not fog or anything like that, but just kind of crummy, which is normal for that in the Seattle area. So Tim's on the phone, and he's like, "Hey, is Ken around?" I'm like, "Yeah, what's going on?" And Tim says, "Oh, we're going to go up and shoot some instrument approaches up at Payne Field tonight." And I'm like, "Oh." And I'm thinking, yeah, kind of crummy out, but yeah, whatever. So I go, "Well, let me let Tim know, or Ken know, hold on a second." So I'm like, "Ken, it's Tim. He says you guys are going to go shoot some approaches." Ken says, "Oh, yeah, tell him to come on over." And by this time, it's dark out. And so within just a few minutes, Tim shows up. And anyway, so I helped them push the airplane out. So we pushed the airplane out, and Mike is my buddy. He's still under the car. And so I helped him push out the Bonanza. And as I walked around, I walked around the tail, and I just remember looking into the cockpit, and the door, the door's open. I look into the cockpit, and I see the single control yoke. And now I did not know at this time what they were specifically doing. My understanding was incorrect, but what I had believed at that time was that, oh, Ken must be going up and doing some flight instruction, with Tim, and I saw the single control yoke, and I remember I just got an overwhelmingly dreadful feeling, because I thought to myself, well, boy, you can't really do much there from the right seat. Now, because in my subconscious mind, when I think about it, it was simply because I didn't I didn't know that what Tim's experience was, and so I thought, gosh, can they even do training with a single control yoke? So anyway, it gave me a very overwhelmingly dreadful feeling. I'll just be honest with you. I just had a really horrible feeling, and I wanted to say something, but of course I knew I wasn't going to say anything because at the time I'm like, that's stupid. You're not going to. I mean, that's fine. These guys know what they're doing. Why would I ever say anything? But I just had a horrible, horrible feeling. Okay, so anyway, so I watched them taxi out, and it's a grass taxiway. I watched them taxi out, and then I watched them take off, and and as I'm walking back down the taxiway, I'm like, just there's nothing to worry about, but it was just bothering me. But anyway, I just sloughed it off and just to being stupid, like, come on. I mean, why? I mean, you've been flying your whole life. Why would you? These guys know what they're doing. And I also thought, we don't fly at night, and so I'm thinking to myself, gosh, we don't fly at night, so that's scaring me. It's crummy weather, but it's always crummy weather around here. And then the single control yoke, well, I mean, it's Ken's airplane. They know what they're doing. So I just thought that I was being dumb thinking that. Well, so anyway, Ken had ordered Mike and I a pizza before he left. We have pizza. I leave. And our house is, like I said, a little bit to the south. It's 2 minutes away. So anyway, so I went home, and it wasn't very long later. I mean, and I don't know what the time differential was from the time that they took off. All I knew was that they were flying up to Payne Field to shoot instrument approaches. Payne Field is about 25 nautical miles north of Seattle. And so anyway, I mean, flying time to get up there, in the Bonanzas, you're talking, 15 minutes, so I don't know what the time frame was, but it didn't seem very long to me. And if it was nighttime, the accident occurred at 5:45 p.m. So it had to have been, and then it probably gets dark at that time of year, maybe around 4:30-ish. So, and they took off in the pitch dark. So, I mean, my guess was it was 40, maybe 45 minutes, or something like that. So, get a phone call at the house, and it was, I just knew exactly what it was. It was a hysterical phone call from not Mike nor his mom, but somebody. You just knew immediately what it was, and that you got to get over here right now. You got, and you could hear commotion. It was just, So I drove over there, and the hangar door was wide open. There were cars erratically parked, if you even want to call it that. I mean, like on the road even. It was, a good 10 cars. And so I went into the house, and I mean, it was a hysterical scene. It was, a horrifically gut-wrenching moment. And, Tim's parents were there, and I remember just seeing them, and it was just it was a hysterical, emotional scene. And so it's one of those things that you remember forever. And it was definitely the most horrific experience I've ever had, because of those families, and you can do absolutely nothing about it. And it's, and they're just in disbelief and shock. And so anyway, so that happened. And as we, and I remember thinking, all these scenarios, like, it was at nighttime, and what happened, and we'll go over this NTSB report, but basically the long and the short of it was lost control of the airplane. And so what I had always thought to myself was, well, would the If they would have had dual controls, would that have made a difference? The one thing that's significant here too is there's an area in the Puget Sound called the Puget Sound Convergence Zone. And that's an area north of Seattle, because if you're looking at me and my nose is Seattle, okay, this is going to be Everett and Payne Field up here. The Olympic Mountains are right here, and they're real rugged mountains, but there's just a small slew of them. The Cascade Range is right here. So the Puget Sound Convergence Zone are storms that will come down from Canada, and they'll squeeze in between the Olympic Mountains and the Cascade Range, and they will go in north of Seattle, and they will create like storms that'll be isolated just in that area, but they won't come south of Seattle. So where we are, down in the Kent area, south of Seattle, yeah, it was spitting a little bit. And like I had mentioned to you earlier, the weather was what that was. But up north, a storm had come down from Canada. So they had gotten into severe turbulence and heavy, heavy rain and fog. And I never could, and I've done research for years, I never could find out if they were shooting an approach. The NTSB report says it was in cruise, but we know it was in that area. We know they were talking to ATC. We know that the controller they were talking to was one of Ken's buddies. But I never did find out, nor could I ever have the guts to ask any of the family about it, or nor talk about it. It's even to this day, it's just something can't be spoken about, and it's just too horrific, too sad, you know. So, but they were in contact. So whether they were on approach, I don't know. But the things that I always thought about were, if I ever feel that way again, if I ever have that feeling, I'm going to say something, just whether people think I'm an idiot or not, I'm just going to say something. And I always thought about that dual control, you know, versus the single yoke. Man, if they just would have had the dual control, could that have made a difference? The radios are on the left side too, which really doesn't mean anything. The control yoke's the main thing. So I always have thought about that control yoke. Would that have made any kind of a difference? You know, so when we talk about risk versus unnecessary risk, well, I mean, flying at night is an unnecessary risk, but a lot of people fly at night. My dad doesn't fly at night. I mean, it's different reasons for different pilots. And here's what my dad talking about why he doesn't fly at night.
Hey, Dad, can you tell me why you didn't feel comfortable flying at night?
Well, because I only got one eye.
Yeah, so if somebody's measuring, let's say, an unnecessary risk, in other words, flying at night, it's going to be different for different pilots. So in your case, that unnecessary risk is greater than, let's say, somebody that's got 20/20 vision or something.
That's true.
Yeah, so
That's true. But I was also pretty cautious about it. But
just in
I
general.
never had a problem. I got it in every time. So, I mean, I figured I just didn't feel comfortable with it.
So what do you remember about that night?
Well, I remember that the weather wasn't very good, and you went over there to help him push out the plane, and that's what I remember. Then after it all happened, I remember you're saying that you weren't really surprised because you were really worried that they were going. I do remember the funeral. It's very sad. I remember his mother. I remember even what she was wearing and how she looked, and yeah, very sad.
So do you remember the night Tim and Ken got
Yes,
killed?
I do, and I remember the circumstances, and the weather was kind of marginal, and they took off and flying toward Everett area, and apparently got it in instrument conditions and lost control. You know, it's a sad thing. I mean, when something like that happens, you don't expect it.
And Tim, he was a good young pilot from all accounts.
Yeah, no, I was.
You know,
So.
and Ken was as well. And I don't know if you ever flew with them in that Bonanza.
No,
Did
I
you ever
never
fly with
did.
them? Yeah. Do you think that throwover control wheel, not having the dual yoke, was a contributing factor at all?
Well, when they first discovered the wreck, it was on the correct side, left side.
Yeah.
if the airplane's really going crazy, it'd be hard to bring it over. Normally, it's pretty simple to swing it over, even on the Baron.
Do you have any opinions about it at all? The accident?
You never know unless you're in the cockpit with them what's really going to happen. And usually it's a loss of control due to mental things. He gets confused. So, yeah.
I recall pushing the airplane out and then looking into the cockpit and seeing the single control yoke, and for some reason that kind of triggered a feeling of dread and
well, I know you
whatever.
had connection with it, so.
Yeah. Well, and that ended up later on when we were looking at that Bonanza and you decided to get that F-35.
Yeah.
Now, do you recall me telling you that, if I didn't go with you, I thought you were going to get killed in that thing?
Yeah. I remember you saying that you were nervous about what might happen and you had to go along. I remember that part.
And what did you think about that? Did that seem weird?
I didn't think much about it at the time, other than the fact that you just wanted to get a free airplane ride or something.
Well,
No, but I have a picture in my mind of you saying that, and my recollection is that it was serious. I could tell it was emotional and deep thinking, and that's what I remember about it. Telling me about that.
what I remember about that is that you felt like you had to go.
Yeah.
I was really surprised because he had no intentions of taking you with him. And then I was surprised when I found out that you said you were going.
So when you look at calculated risks, and you look at that night with Tim and Ken, so they had the throw over control wheel, and then they had the fact they were flying at night, and then it was poor weather. Do you think that eliminating any one of those factors would have possibly, created a different outcome?
Well, possibly. It just depends on the mental of the pilot, And once they get confused, then sometimes don't get out of that. Stay confused. Right, left, right, what to do. So I've never had that problem of being confused. I've always been able to come to a conclusion really quick and come up with a solution. So. I always felt comfortable. You can feel uncomfortable flying at night in a stormy situation like I did coming up from Vegas one time, and but I just then never panicked. If you panic, and I've never had that problem, you lose ability to determine what's going on and what actions to take if you're panicked. Woo. So.
Well, and you had told me one time about you were shooting an approach in the old 310 way back when, and you had vertigo real bad.
Oh, no, yeah, that was going into Hillsboro, yeah, vertigo. I got vertigo, the leans, and so I'm leaning, but I'm still mentally okay. I'm just leaning and feeling kind of strange that way, and I'm just looking at the instrument panel, making an IFR approach into Hillsboro, and I broke out and landed okay. Now, and I never got it again.
So you think there's some truth to the fact that maybe some people aren't cut out to be pilots?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anytime you don't have full control of what's going on all the time and get confused pretty easy, you shouldn't be getting in an airplane.
So now let's look over this NTSB report here real quick. Let's go over this briefly. And here we go. Let's look at that.
So here we are looking at the final report from the NTSB. And so let's just go over it here. Like I said, it is brief. November 6th, 1986, 2 fatalities. So witness observed the aircraft impact an open field during a heavy rain. Rain, fog, and turbulence in the clouds were reported in the area at the time. The aircraft was in a right-hand turn when it impacted. And so Ken was a newly a new instrument-rated pilot, and he was getting complex aircraft time in preparation for his commercial check ride in a similar aircraft 2 days after this, which is interesting. Then it says here about Ken, the new ATR pilot. I think that means ATP, because an ATR rated pilot would be an ATR aircraft, and in those days the only thing they had was an ATR 42, and that didn't go into service until 85, so I'm sure they mean ATP. Was in the right seat. Radios and throw over control wheel was on the left side position. And probable cause and findings. Now they say this occurred during cruise, and like I said earlier, I know they were up there attempting to shoot instrument approaches. Wish we had a little bit more information, but that's what it says. Weather condition rain, weather condition turbulence in the cloud, so they were IMC. Night or light condition, dark night. Weather evaluation, misjudged pilot in command, self-induced pressure, pilot in command. Aircraft handling not maintained, pilot in command. Descent, inadvertent, pilot in command. Lack of familiarity with the aircraft, pilot in command. And then when we take a look here, this is interesting. So we know about the K35 Bonanza, 250 horsepower. But when we look at hours, this is what I want you to look at. Flight time for Tim, again, 20 years old, in the left seat. 356 hours total time, 3 hours in a Bonanza, and not in this airplane. 284 hours as pilot in command, all aircraft. 64 hours last 90, 8 hours last 30, all aircraft. And it says 10 hours last 24 hours, all aircraft. I'm not sure. That's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Don't understand that. Maybe somebody does. I don't know what that means. So anyway, the interesting thing about this, so you can look at this a couple ways. In some ways, it reminds you maybe a little bit of the Buddy Holly accident, where the pilot was, it was dark night. They got into IMC inadvertently. This could have been the case here, although if they're shooting instrument approaches, wouldn't really have mattered. However, bad weather and an unfamiliar aircraft in this situation with Tim, and then in the Buddy Holly situation, the pilot was unfamiliar with the gyro. So it's just kind of an example of some things that, I would imagine that Tim probably had quite a bit, quite a number of hours of this 356, maybe in their 207, but that's just a guess. I wouldn't know that for sure, but it would seem logical. So on the one hand, you look at this and you say, wow, on one hand, you can argue that he did everything right. He's got Ken in there with him. He'd had some time in a Bonanza now, and then he's going to be taking this, instruction in a couple days in a Bonanza. Seems pretty smart to go up in a Bonanza. So, like we talked about in the very beginning, this isn't like there is nothing in here that you go, oh my gosh. And that's what I find so scary about it, is that if we just were to eliminate one factor, whether it be that they were in the Puget Sound convergence zone with that storm, or what if they would have been in the storm, but it would have been during the daytime instead of at night? What about if they would have had the dual controls in there? So it's just kind of something that I've always thought about, and when I read about accidents, I always think about this is the one that I think about in my life, and why. If we can help one person save one person's life, how it impacts the families, because that is a horrendous thing to observe and to be in, is those families' grief in that moment. That was absolutely horrific. And when you see on TV these families convulsively crying, in these airline crashes, this is what I think about. So I hope that you'll take something from this. And And again, it's the stacking of the unnecessary risks. That's what I think about when I think of this. So if you were to eliminate a few of those risks, i.e., maybe don't fly at night. If you're going to be a commercial pilot, when you're in an airliner, they have a lot more redundant fail-safes than a single-engine piston aircraft at night in poor weather, and in this case with a single control yoke. So there's just things that can stack up against you. And so anyway, I really would like to hear your comments. What would you have done differently? Would you have said something if you were me, or just did what I did? What about Tim? Would there have been anything you would have done differently? What about Ken, who was in the right seat? Anything that you would have done differently there? Again, oh, and let me say this. Now that we look at this, Tim was an instrument rated pilot, so there was nothing dangerous, okay, or wrong about having the single control yoke. So they did nothing wrong there. There was nothing illegal about it. He was an instrument rated pilot. So if you think about it, hey, having another instrument rated pilot next to you, an ATP, the owner of the airplane, that's a pretty safe thing to do. And so I hope that you can get something out of this. I really, really do. So anyway, thanks so much, and we'll talk to y'all later.